Chapter 7: The Dancing Girl of Sidi Aissa. Tarzan's first mission did not bid fair to be either exciting or vastly important. There was a certain lieutenant of Spahis whom the government had reason to suspect of improper relations with a great European power. This Lieutenant Gernois, who was at present stationed at Sidi-bel-Abbes, had recently been attached to the general staff, where certain information of great military value had come into his possession in the ordinary routine of his duties. It was this information which the government suspected the great power was bartering for with the officer. It was at most but a vague hint dropped by a certain notorious Parisienne in a jealous mood that had caused suspicion to rest upon the lieutenant. But general staffs are jealous of their secrets, and treason so serious a thing that even a hint of it may not be safely neglected. And so it was that Tarzan had come to Algeria in the guise of an American hunter and traveler to keep a close eye upon Lieutenant Gernois. He had looked forward with keen delight to again seeing his beloved Africa, but this northern aspect of it was so different from his tropical jungle home that he might as well have been back in Paris for all the heart thrills of homecoming that he experienced. At Oran he spent a day wandering through the narrow, crooked alleys of the Arab quarter, enjoying the strange new sights. The next day found him at Sidi-bel-Abbes, where he presented his letters of introduction to both civil and military authorities, letters which gave no clue to the real significance of his mission. Tarzan possessed a sufficient command of English to enable him to pass among Arabs and Frenchmen as an American, and that was all that was required of it. When he met an Englishman, he spoke French in order that he might not betray himself, but occasionally talked in English to foreigners who understood that tongue, but could not note the slight imperfections of accent and pronunciation that were his. Here he became acquainted with many of the French officers, and soon became a favorite among them. He met Gernois, whom he found to be a taciturn, dyspeptic-looking man of about 40, having little or no social intercourse with his fellows. For a month, nothing of moment occurred. Gernois apparently had no visitors, nor did he on his occasional visits to the town hold communication with any who might, even by the wildest flight of imagination, be construed into secret agents of a foreign power. Tarzan was beginning to hope that after all the rumor might have been false, when suddenly Gernois was ordered to Bouira in the Petit Sahara, far to the south. A company of Spahis and 3 officers were to relieve another company already stationed there. Fortunately, one of the officers, Captain Gerard, had become an excellent friend of Tarzan's, and so when the ape-man suggested that he should embrace the opportunity of accompanying him to Bouira, where he expected to find hunting, it caused not the slightest suspicion. At Bouira, the detachment detrained, and the balance of the journey was made in the saddle. As Tarzan was dickering at Bouira for a mount, he caught a brief glimpse of a man in European clothes, eyeing him from the doorway of a native coffee-house. But as Tarzan looked, the man turned and entered the little, low-ceilinged mud hut. And but for a haunting impression that there had been something familiar about the face or figure of the fellow, Tarzan gave the matter no further thought. The march to Ouled-Nail was fatiguing to Tarzan, whose equestrian experiences hitherto had been confined to a course of riding lessons in a Parisian academy. And so it was that he quickly sought the comforts of a bed in the Hotel Grossart, while the officers and troops took up their quarters at the military post. Although Tarzan was called early the following morning, the company of Spahis was on the march before he had finished his breakfast. He was hurrying through his meal that the soldiers might not get too far in advance of him, when he glanced through the door connecting the dining room with the bar. To his surprise, he saw Gernois standing there in conversation with the very stranger he had seen in the coffee-house at Bouira the day previous. He could not be mistaken, for there was the same strangely familiar attitude and figure, though the man's back was toward him. As his eyes lingered on the two, Gernois looked up and caught the intent expression on Tarzan's face. The stranger was talking in a low whisper at the time, but the French officer immediately interrupted him, and the two at once turned away and passed out of the range of Tarzan's vision. This was the first suspicious occurrence that Tarzan had ever witnessed in connection with Gernois's actions, but he was positive that the men had left the barroom solely because Gernois had caught Tarzan's eyes upon them. Then there was the persistent impression of familiarity about the stranger to further augment the ape-man's belief that here at length was something which would bear watching. A moment later, Tarzan entered the bar room, but the men had left, nor did he see aught of them in the street beyond, though he found a pretext to ride to various shops before he set out after the column, which had now considerable start of him. He did not overtake them, until he reached Sidi Aissa shortly after noon, where the soldiers had halted for an hour's rest. Here he found Gernois with the column, but there was no sign of the stranger. It was market day at Sidi Aissa, and the numberless caravans of camels coming in from the desert and the crowds of bickering Arabs in the marketplace filled Tarzan with a consuming desire to remain for a day that he might see more of these sons of the desert. Thus it was that the company of Spahis marched on that afternoon toward Bou Saada without him. He spent the hours until dark wandering about the market in company with a youthful Arab, one Abdul, who had been recommended to him by the innkeeper as a trustworthy servant and interpreter. Here Tarzan purchased a better mount than the one he had selected at Bouira, and entering into conversation with the stately Arab to whom the animal had belonged, learned that the seller was Kadour ben Saden, sheikh of a desert tribe far south of Jelfa. Through Abdul, Tarzan invited his new acquaintance to dine with him. As the three were making their way through the crowds of marketers, camels, donkeys, and horses that filled the marketplace with a confusing babble of sounds, Abdul plucked at Tarzan's sleeve. "Look, master, behind us," and he turned, pointing at a figure which disappeared behind a camel as Tarzan turned. "He has been following us about all afternoon," continued Abdul. "I caught only a glimpse of an Arab in a dark blue burnous and white turban," replied Tarzan. "Is it he you mean?" "Yes. I suspected him because he seems a stranger here, without other business than following us, which is not the way of the Arab who is honest, and also because he keeps the lower part of his face hidden, only his eyes showing. He must be a bad man, or he would have honest business of his own to occupy his time." "He is on the wrong scent then, Abdul," replied Tarzan, "for no one here can have any grievance against me. This is my first visit to your country, and none knows me. He will soon discover his error and cease to follow us." "Unless he be bent on robbery," returned Abdul. "Then all we can do is wait until he is ready to try his hand upon us," laughed Tarzan, "and I warrant that he will get his belly full of robbing now that we are prepared for him." And so he dismissed the subject from his mind, though he was destined to recall it before many hours through a most unlooked-for occurrence. Kadour ben Saden, having dined well, prepared to take leave of his host. With dignified protestations of friendship, he invited Tarzan to visit him in his wild domain, where the antelope, the stag, the boar, the panther, and the lion might still be found in sufficient numbers to tempt an ardent huntsman. On his departure, the ape-man, with Abdul, wandered again into the streets of Sidi Aissa, where he was soon attracted by the wild din of sound coming from the open doorway of one of the numerous cafés Moores. It was after 8, and the dancing was in full swing as Tarzan entered. The room was filled to repletion with Arabs. All were smoking and drinking their thick, hot coffee. Tarzan and Abdul found seats near the center of the room, though the terrific noise produced by the musicians upon their Arab drums and pipes would have rendered a seat farther from them more acceptable to the quiet-loving ape-man. A rather good-looking Ouled-Nail was dancing, and, perceiving Tarzan's European clothes, and scenting a generous gratuity, she threw her silken handkerchief upon his shoulder to be rewarded with a franc. When her place upon the floor had been taken by another, the bright-eyed Abdul saw her in conversation with 2 Arabs at the far side of the room, near a side door that let upon an inner court, around the gallery of which were the rooms occupied by the girls who danced in this café. At first he thought nothing of the matter, but presently he noticed from the corner of his eye one of the men nod in their direction, and the girl turn and shoot a furtive glance at Tarzan. Then the Arabs melted through the doorway into the darkness of the court. When it came again, the girls turned to dance. She hovered close to Tarzan, and for the ape-man alone were her sweetest smiles. Many an ugly scowl was cast upon the tall European by swarthy, dark-eyed sons of the desert, but neither smiles nor scowls produced any outwardly visible effect upon him. Again the girl cast her handkerchief upon his shoulder, and again was she rewarded with a franc piece. As she was sticking it upon her forehead, after the custom of her kind, she bent low toward Tarzan, whispering a quick word in his ear. "There are two without in the court," she said quickly in broken French, "who would harm monsieur. At first I promised to lure you to them, but you have been kind, and I cannot do it. Go quickly, before they find that I have failed them. I think that they are very bad men." Tarzan thanked the girl, assuring her that he would be careful, and, having finished her dance, she crossed to the little doorway and went out into the court. But Tarzan did not leave the café as she had urged. For another half-hour, nothing unusual occurred. Then a surly-looking Arab entered the café from the street. He stood near Tarzan, where he deliberately made insulting remarks about the European. But as they were in his native tongue, Tarzan was entirely innocent of their purport, until Abdul took it upon himself to enlighten him. "This fellow is looking for trouble," warned Abdul. "He is not alone. In fact, in case of a disturbance, nearly every man here would be against you. It would be better to leave quietly, master." "Ask the fellow what he wants," commanded Tarzan. "He says that the dog of a Christian insulted the Ouled-Nail, who belongs to him. He means trouble, monsieur. Tell him that I did not insult his or any other Ouled-Nail, that I wish him to go away and leave me alone, that I have no quarrel with him, nor has he any with me." "He says," replied Abdul after delivering this message to the Arab, "that besides being a dog yourself, that you are the son of one, and that your grandmother was a hyena. Incidentally, you are a liar." The attention of those nearby had now been attracted by the altercation, and the sneering laughs that followed this torrent of invective easily indicated the trend of the sympathies of the majority of the audience. Tarzan did not like being laughed at, neither did he relish the terms applied to him by the Arab, but he showed no sign of anger as he arose from his seat upon the bench. A half-smile played about his lips, but of a sudden a mighty fist shot into the face of the scowling Arab, and back of it were the terrible muscles of the ape-man. At the instant that the man fell, a half-dozen fierce plainsmen sprang into the room from where they had apparently been waiting for their cue in the street before the café. With cries of "Kill the unbeliever" and "Down with the dog of a Christian," they made straight for Tarzan. A number of the younger Arabs in the audience sprang to their feet to join in the assault upon the unarmed white man. Tarzan and Abdul were rushed back toward the end of the room by the very force of numbers opposing them. The young Arab remained loyal to his master, and with drawn knife fought at his side. With tremendous blows, the ape-man felled all who came within reach of his powerful hands. He fought quietly and without a word, upon his lips the same half-smile they had worn as he rose to strike down the man who had insulted him. It seemed impossible that either he or Abdul could survive the sea of wicked-looking swords and knives that surrounded them, but the very numbers of their assailants proved the best bulwark of their safety. So closely packed was the howling, cursing mob that no weapon could be wielded to advantage, and none of the Arabs dared use a firearm for fear of wounding one of his compatriots. Finally, Tarzan succeeded in seizing one of the most persistent of his attackers. With a quick wrench, he disarmed the fellow, and then, holding him before them as a shield, he backed slowly beside Abdul toward the little door which led into the inner courtyard. At the threshold he paused for an instant, and lifting the struggling Arab above his head, hurled him, as though from a catapult, full in the faces of his on-pressing fellows. Then Tarzan and Abdul stepped into the semi-darkness of the court. The frightened Ouled-Nails were crouching at the tops of the stairs which led to their respective rooms, the only light in the courtyard coming from the sickly candles which each girl had stuck with its own grease to the woodwork of her doorframe, the better to display her charms to those who might happen to traverse the dark enclosure. Scarcely had Tarzan and Abdul emerged from the room ere a revolver spoke close at their backs from the shadows beneath one of the stairways, and as they turned to meet this new antagonist, two muffled figures sprang toward them, firing as they came. Tarzan leapt to meet these two new assailants. The foremost lay, a second later, in the trampled dirt of the court, disarmed and groaning from a broken wrist. Abdul's knife found the vitals of the second in the instant that the fellow's revolver missed fire as he held it to the faithful Arab's forehead. The maddened horde within the café were now rushing out in pursuit of their quarry. The Ouled-Nails had extinguished their candles at a cry from one of their number, and the only light within the yard came feebly from the open and half-blocked door of the café. Tarzan had seized a sword from the man who had fallen before Abdul's knife, and now he stood waiting for the rush of men that was coming in search of them through the darkness. Suddenly, he felt a light hand upon his shoulder from behind, and a woman's voice whispering, "Quick, monsieur, this way, follow me." "Come, Abdul," said Tarzan in a low tone to the youth, "we can be no worse off elsewhere than we are here." The woman turned and led them up the narrow stairway that ended at the door of her quarters. Tarzan was close beside her. He saw the gold and silver bracelets upon her bare arms, the strings of gold coin that depended from her hair ornaments, and the gorgeous colors of her dress. He saw that she was a Ouled-Nail, and instinctively he knew that she was the same who had whispered the warning in his ear earlier in the evening. As they reached the top of the stairs, they could hear the angry crowd searching the yard beneath. "Soon they will search here," whispered the girl. "They must not find you, for though you fight with the strength of many men, they will kill you in the end. Hasten, you can drop from the farther window of my room to the street beyond. Before they discover that you are no longer in the court of the buildings, you will be safe within the hotel." But even as she spoke, several men had started up the stairway at the head of which they stood. There was a sudden cry from one of the searchers. They had been discovered. Quickly the crowd rushed for the stairway. The foremost assailant leaped quickly upward, but at the top he met the sudden sword that he had not expected. The quarry had been unarmed before. With a cry, the man toppled back upon those behind him. Like tenpins, they rolled down the stairs. The ancient and rickety structure could not withstand the strain of this unwanted weight and jarring. With a creaking and rending of breaking wood, it collapsed beneath the Arabs, leaving Tarzan, Abdul, and the girl alone upon the frail platform at the top. "Come," cried the Ouled-Nail. "They will reach us from another stairway through the room next to mine. We have not a moment to spare." Just as they were entering the room, Abdul heard and translated a cry from the yard below for several to hasten to the street and cut off escape from that side. "We are lost now," said the girl simply. "We?" questioned Tarzan. "Yes, monsieur," she responded. "They will kill me as well. Have I not aided you?" This put a different aspect on the matter. Tarzan had rather been enjoying the excitement and danger of the encounter. He had not for an instant supposed that either Abdul or the girl could suffer except through accident, and he had only retreated just enough to keep from being killed himself. He had had no intention of running away until he saw that he was hopelessly lost, were he to remain. Alone he could have sprung into the midst of that close-packed mob, and, laying about him after the fashion of Numa, the lion, have struck the Arabs with such consternation that escape would have been easy. Now he must think entirely of these two faithful friends. He crossed to the window which overlooked the street. In a minute there would be enemies below. Already he could hear the mob clambering the stairway to the next quarters. They would be at the door beside him in another instant. He put a foot upon the sill and leaned. Out, but he did not look down. Above him, within arm's reach, was the low roof of the building. He called to the girl. She came and stood beside him. He put a great arm about her and lifted her across his shoulder. "Wait here until I reach down for you from above," he said to Abdul. "In the meantime, shove everything in the room against that door. It may delay them long enough." Then he stepped to the sill of the narrow window with the girl upon his shoulders. "Hold tight," he cautioned her. A moment later he had clambered to the roof above with the ease and dexterity of an ape. Setting the girl down, he leaned far over the roof's edge, calling softly to Abdul. The youth ran to the window. "Your hand," whispered Tarzan. The men in the room beyond were battering at the door. With a sudden crash it fell splintering in, and at the same instant Abdul felt himself lifted like a feather onto the roof above. They were not a moment too soon, for as the men broke into the room which they had just quitted, a dozen more rounded the corner in the street below and came running to a spot beneath the girl's window. Chapter 8. The Fight in the Desert. As the three squatted upon the roof above the quarters of the Ouled-Nails, they heard the angry cursing of the Arabs in the room beneath. Abdul translated from time to Tarzan. "They are berating those in the street below now," said Abdul, "for permitting us to escape so easily. Those in the street say that we did not come that way, that we are still within the building, and that those above, being too cowardly to attack us, are attempting to deceive them into believing that we have escaped. In a moment they will have fighting of their own to attend to if they continue their brawling. Presently those in the building gave up the search and returned to the café. A few remained in the street below, smoking and talking. Tarzan spoke to the girl, thanking her for the sacrifice she had made for him, a total stranger. "I liked you," she said simply. "You were unlike the others who come to the café. You did not speak coarsely to me. The manner in which you gave me money was not an insult." "What shall you do after tonight?" he asked. "You cannot return to the café. Can you even remain with safety in Sidi Aissa?" "Tomorrow it will be forgotten," she replied, "but I should be glad if it might be that I need never return to this or another café. I have not remained because I wished to. I have been a prisoner." "A prisoner?" ejaculated Tarzan incredulously. "A slave would be the better word," she answered. "I was stolen in the night from my father's douar by a band of marauders. They brought me here and sold me to the Arab who keeps this café. It has been nearly 2 years now since I saw the last of mine own people. They are very far to the south. They never come to Sidi Aissa." "You would like to return to your people?" asked Tarzan. "Then I shall promise to see you safely, so far as Bouira at least. There we can doubtless arrange with the commandant to send you the rest of the way." "Oh, monsieur," she cried, "how can I ever repay you? You cannot really mean that you will do so much for a poor Ouled-Nail. But my father can reward you, and he will, for is he not a great sheikh? He is Kadour ben Saden." "Kadour ben Saden," ejaculated Tarzan. "Why, Kadour ben Saden is in Sidi Aissa this very night. He dined with me but a few hours since." "My father in Sidi Aissa," cried the amazed girl. "Allah be praised then, for I am indeed saved." "Hish," cautioned Abdul, "listen." From below came the sound of voices, quite distinguishable upon the still night air. Tarzan could not understand the words, but Abdul and the girl translated. "They have gone now," said the latter. "It is you they want, monsieur. One of them said that the stranger who had offered money for your slaying lay in the house of Ahmed din Soulef with a broken wrist, but that he had offered a still greater reward if some would lay in wait for you upon the road to Bouira and kill you." "It is he who followed monsieur about the market today," exclaimed Abdul. "I saw him again within the café, him and another, and the two went out into the inner court after talking with this girl here. It was they who attacked and fired upon us as we came out of the café. Why do they wish to kill you, monsieur?" "I do not know," replied Tarzan, and then, after a pause, "unless—" But he did not finish, for the thought that had come to his mind, while it seemed the only reasonable solution of the mystery, appeared at the same time quite improbable. Presently the men in the street went away. The courtyard and the café were deserted. Cautiously, Tarzan lowered himself to the sill of the girl's window. The room was empty. He returned to the roof and let Abdul down. Then he lowered the girl to the arms of the waiting Arab. From the window, Abdul dropped the short distance to the street below, while Tarzan took the girl in his arms and leaped down as he had done on so many other occasions in his own forest with a burden in his arms. A little cry of alarm was startled from the girl's lips, but Tarzan landed in the street with but an imperceptible jar and lowered her in safety to her feet. She clung to him for a moment. "How strong monsieur is, and how active," she cried. "El-Adrea, the black lion, himself is not more so." "I should like to meet this El-Adrea of yours," he said. "I have heard much about him." "And you come to the douar of my father, you shall see him," said the girl. "He lives in a spur of the mountains north of us, and comes down from his lair at night to rob my father's douar. With a single blow of his mighty paw, he crushes the skull of a bull, and woe betide the belated wayfarer who meets El-Adrea abroad at night." Without further mishap, they reached the hotel. The sleepy landlord objected strenuously to instituting a search for Kadour ben Saden until the following morning. But a piece of gold put a different aspect on the matter, so that a few moments later a servant had started to make the rounds of the lesser native hostelries where it might be expected that a desert sheik would find congenial associations. Tarzan had felt it necessary to find the girl's father that night, for fear he might start on his homeward journey too early in the morning to be intercepted. They had waited perhaps half an hour when the messenger returned with Kadour ben Saden. The old sheikh entered the room with a questioning expression upon his proud face. "Monsieur has done me the honor to—" he commenced, and then his eyes fell upon the girl. With outstretched arms he crossed the room to meet her. "My daughter," he cried, "Allah is merciful." And tears dimmed the martial eyes of the old warrior when the story of her abduction and her final rescue had been told to Kadour ben Saden. He extended his hand to Tarzan. "All that is Kadour ben Saden's is thine, my friend, even to his life," he said very simply. But Tarzan knew that those were no idle words. It was decided that although 3 of them would have to ride after practically no sleep, it would be best to make an early start in the morning and attempt to ride all the way to Bouira in one day. It would have been comparatively easy for the men, but for the girl it was sure to be a fatiguing journey. She, however, was the most anxious to undertake it, for it seemed to her that she could not quickly enough reach the family and friends from whom she had been separated for 2 years. It seemed to Tarzan that he had not closed his eyes before he was awakened, and in another hour the party was on its way south toward Bouira. For a few miles the road was good, and they made rapid progress, but suddenly it became only a waste of sand, into which the horses sank fetlock deep at nearly every step. In addition to Tarzan, Abdul, the sheikh, and his daughter were 4 of the wild plainsmen of the sheikh's tribe who had accompanied him upon the trip to Sidi Aissa. Thus, 7 guns strong, they entertained little fear of attack by day, and if all went well, they should reach Bouira before nightfall. A brisk wind enveloped them in the blowing sand of the desert, until Tarzan's lips were parched and cracked. What little he could see of the surrounding country was far from alluring. A vast expanse of rough country, rolling in little barren hillocks, and tufted here and there with clumps of dreary shrub. Far to the south rose the dim lines of the Saharan Atlas range. How different, thought Tarzan, from the gorgeous Africa of his boyhood. Abdul, always on the alert, looked backward quite as often as he did ahead. At the top of each hillock that they mounted, he would draw in his horse and, turning, scan the country to the rear with utmost care. At last his scrutiny was rewarded. "Look," he cried, "there are 6 horsemen behind us." "Your friends of last evening, no doubt, monsieur," remarked Kadour ben Saden dryly to Tarzan. "No doubt," replied the ape-man. "I am sorry that my society should endanger the safety of your journey. At the next village, I shall remain and question these gentlemen while you ride on. There is no necessity for my being at Bouira tonight, and less still why you should not ride in peace." "If you stop, we shall stop," said Kadour ben Saden. "Until you are safe with your friends, or the enemy has left your trail, we shall remain with you. There is nothing more to say." Tarzan nodded his head. He was a man of few words, and possibly it was for this reason, as much as any, that Kadour ben Saden had taken to him. For if there be one thing that an Arab despises, it is a talkative man. All the balance of the day, Abdul caught glimpses of the horsemen in their rear. They remained always at about the same distance. During the occasional halts for rest, and at the longer halt at noon, they approached no closer. "They are waiting for darkness," said Kadour ben Saden, and darkness came before they reached Bouira. The last glimpse that Abdul had of the grim, white-robed figures that trailed them just before dusk made it impossible to distinguish them, had made it apparent that they were rapidly closing up the distance that intervened between them and their intended quarry. He whispered this fact to Tarzan, for he did not wish to alarm the girl. The ape-man drew back beside him. "You will ride ahead with the others, Abdul," said Tarzan. "This is my quarrel. I shall wait at the next convenient spot and interview these fellows." "Then Abdul shall wait at thy side," replied the young Arab, nor would any threats or commands move him from his decision. "Very well then," replied Tarzan. "Here is as good a place as we could wish. Here are rocks at the top of this hillock. We shall remain hidden here and give an account of ourselves to these gentlemen when they appear." They drew in their horses and dismounted. The others riding ahead were already out of sight in the darkness. Beyond them shone the lights of Bouira. Tarzan removed his rifle from its boot and loosened his revolver in its holster. He ordered Abdul to withdraw behind the rocks with the horses so that they should be shielded from the enemy's bullets should they fire. The young Arab pretended to do as he was bid, but when he had fastened the two animals securely to a low shrub, he crept back to lie on his belly a few paces behind Tarzan. The ape-man stood erect in the middle of the road, waiting. Nor did he have long to wait. The sound of galloping horses came suddenly out of the darkness below him, and a moment later he discerned the moving blotches of lighter color against the solid background of the night. "Halt!" he cried, "or we fire!" The white figures came to a sudden stop, and for a moment there was silence. Then came the sound of a whispered counsel, and like ghosts, the phantom riders dispersed in all directions. Again the desert lay still about him, yet it was an ominous stillness that foreboded evil. Abdul raised himself to one knee. Tarzan cocked his jungle-trained ears, and presently there came to him the sound of horses walking quietly through the sand to the east of him, to the west, to the north, and to the south. They had been surrounded. Then a shot came from the direction in which he was looking, a bullet whirred through the air above his head, and he fired at the flash of the enemy's gun. Instantly, the soundless waste was torn with the quick staccato of guns upon every hand. Abdul and Tarzan fired only at the flashes. They could not yet see their foemen. Presently, it became evident that the attackers were circling their position, drawing closer and closer in as they began to realize the paltry numbers of the party which opposed them. But one came too close, for Tarzan was accustomed to using his eyes in the darkness of the jungle night, than which there is no more utter darkness, this side the grave, and with a cry of pain, a saddle was emptied. "The odds are evening, Abdul," said Tarzan with a low laugh, but they were still far too one-sided, and when the 5 remaining horsemen whirled at a signal and charged full upon them, it looked as if there would be a sudden ending of the battle. Both Tarzan and Abdul sprang to the shelter of the rocks that they might keep the enemy in front of them. There was a mad clatter of galloping hooves, a volley of shots from both sides, and the Arabs withdrew to repeat the maneuver. But there were now only 4 against the 2. For a few moments there came no sound from out of the surrounding blackness. Tarzan could not tell whether the Arabs, satisfied with their losses, had given up the fight, or were waiting farther along the road to waylay them as they proceeded on toward Bouira. But he was not left long in doubt, for now all from one direction came the sound of a new charge. But scarcely had the first gun spoken, ere a dozen shots rang out behind the Arabs. There came the wild shouts of a new party to the controversy, and the pounding of the feet of many horses from down the road to Bouira. The Arabs did not wait to learn the identity of the oncomers. With a parting volley as they dashed by the position which Tarzan and Abdul were holding, they plunged off along the road towards Sidi Aissa. A moment later, Kadour ben Saden and his men dashed up. The old sheikh was much relieved to find that neither Tarzan nor Abdul had received a scratch. Not even had their horses been wounded. They sought out the 2 men who had fallen before Tarzan's shots, and finding that both were dead, left them where they lay. "Why did you not tell me that you contemplated ambushing those fellows?" asked the sheikh in a hurt tone. "We might have had them all if the 7 of us had stopped to meet them." "Then it would have been useless to stop at all," replied Tarzan, "for had we simply ridden on toward Bouira, they would have been upon us presently, and all could have been engaged. It was to prevent the transfer of my own quarrel to another's shoulders that Abdul and I stopped off to question them. Then there is your daughter. I could not be the cause of exposing her needlessly to the marksmanship of 6 men." Kadour ben Saden shrugged his shoulders. He did not relish having been cheated out of a fight. The little battle so close to Bouira had drawn out a company of soldiers. Tarzan and his party met them just outside the town. The officer in charge halted them to learn the significance of the shots. "A handful of marauders," replied Kadour ben Saden. "They attacked 2 of our number who had dropped behind, but when we returned to them, the fellows soon dispersed. They left 2 dead. None of my party was injured." This seemed to satisfy the officer, and after taking the names of the party, he marched his men on toward the scene of the skirmish to bring back the dead men for purposes of identification, if possible. 2 days later, Kadour ben Saden, with his daughter and followers, rode south through the pass below Bouira, bound for their home in the far wilderness. The sheikh had urged Tarzan to accompany him, and the girl had added her entreaties to those of her father, but though he could not explain it to them, Tarzan's duties loomed particularly large after the happenings of the past few days, so that he could not think of leaving his post for an instant. But he promised to come later if it lay within his power to do so, and they had to content themselves with that assurance. During these 2 days, Tarzan had spent practically all his time with Kadour ben Saden and his daughter. He was keenly interested in this race of stern and dignified warriors, and embraced the opportunity which their friendship offered to learn what he could of their lives and customs. He even commenced to acquire the rudiments of their language under the pleasant tutorage of the brown-eyed girl. It was with real regret that he saw them depart, and he sat his horse at the opening to the pass, as far as which he had accompanied them, gazing after the little party as long as he could catch a glimpse of them. Here were people after his own heart. Their wild, rough lives, filled with danger and hardship, appealed to this half-savage man as nothing had appealed to him in the midst of the effeminate civilization of the great cities he had visited. Here was a life that excelled even that of the jungle, for here he might have the society of men, real men whom he could honor and respect, and yet be near to the wild nature that he loved. In his head revolved an idea that when he had completed his mission, he would resign and return to live for the remainder of his life with the tribe of Kadour ben Saden. Then he turned his horse's head and rode slowly back to Bou Saada. The front of the Hotel du Petit Sahara, where Tarzan stopped in Bou Saada, is taken up with the bar, 2 dining rooms, and the kitchens. Both of the dining rooms open directly off the bar, and one of them is reserved for the use of the officers of the garrison. As you stand in the bar room, you may look into either of the dining rooms if you wish. It was to the bar that Tarzan repaired after speeding Kadour ben Saden and his party on their way. It was yet early in the morning, for Kadour ben Saden had elected to ride far that day, so that it happened that when Tarzan returned, there were guests still at breakfast. As his casual glance wandered into the officers' dining room, Tarzan saw something which brought a look of interest to his eyes. Lieutenant Gernois was sitting there, and as Tarzan looked, a white-robed Arab approached, and bending whispered a few words into the lieutenant's ear. Then he passed on out of the building through another door. In itself the thing was nothing, but as the man had stooped to speak to the officer, Tarzan had caught sight of something which the accidental parting of the man's burnous had revealed. He carried his left arm in a sling. Chapter 9. Numa el Adrea. On the same day that Kadour ben Saden rode south, the diligence from the north brought Tarzan a letter from Gernois, which had been forwarded from Sidi-bel-Abbes. It opened the old wound that Tarzan would have been glad to have forgotten. Yet he was not sorry that Gernois had written, for one at least of his subjects could never cease to interest the ape-man. Here is the letter. My dear Jean, since last I wrote you, I have been across to London on a matter of business. I was there but 3 days. The very first day I came upon an old friend of yours, quite unexpectedly, in Henrietta Street. Now you never in the world would guess whom. None other than Mr. Samuel T. Philander. But it is true, I can see your look of incredulity. Nor is this all. He insisted that I return to the hotel with him, and there I found the others. Professor Archimedes Q, Porter, Miss Porter, and that enormous black woman, Miss Porter's maid. Esmeralda, you will recall. While I was there, Clayton came in. They are to be married soon, or rather sooner, for I rather suspect that we shall receive announcements almost any day. On account of his father's death, it is to be a very quiet affair. Only blood relatives. While I was alone with Mr. Philander, the old fellow became rather confidential. Said Miss Porter had already postponed the wedding on 3 different occasions. He confided that it appeared to him that she was not particularly anxious to marry Clayton at all, but this time it seems that it is quite likely to go through. Of course they all asked after you, but I respected your wishes in the matter of your true origin, and only spoke to them of your present affairs. Miss Porter was especially interested in everything I had to say about you, and asked many questions. I am afraid I took a rather unchivalrous delight in picturing your desire, and resolved to go back eventually to your native jungle. I was sorry afterward, for it did seem to cause her real anguish to contemplate the awful dangers to which you wished to return. And yet, she said, I do not know. There are more unhappy fates than the grim and terrible jungle presence to Monsieur Tarzan. At least his conscience will be free from remorse, and there are moments of quiet and restfulness by day, and vistas of exquisite beauty. You may find it strange that I should say it, who experienced such terrifying experiences in that frightful forest, yet at times I long to return, for I cannot but feel that the happiest moments of my life were spent there. There was an expression of ineffable sadness on her face as she spoke, and I could not but feel that she knew that I knew her secret, and that this was her way of transmitting to you a last tender message from a heart that might still enshrine your memory, though its possessor belonged to another. Clayton appeared nervous and ill at ease while you were the subject of conversation. He wore a worried and harassed expression, yet he was very kindly in his expressions of interest in you. I wonder if he suspects the truth about you. Tennington came in with Clayton. They are great friends, you know. He is about to set out upon one of his interminable cruises in that yacht of his, and was urging the entire party to accompany him. Tried to inveigle me into it too. Is thinking of circumnavigating Africa this time. I told him that his precious toy would take him and some of his friends to the bottom of the ocean one of these days if he didn't get it out of his head that she was a liner or a battleship. I returned to Paris day before yesterday, and yesterday I met the Count and Countess de Coude at the races. They inquired after you. De Coude really seems quite fond of you. Doesn't appear to harbour the least ill will. Olga is as beautiful as ever, but a trifle subdued. I imagine that she learned a lesson through her acquaintance with you that will serve her in good stead during the balance of her life. It is fortunate for her, and for de Coude as well, that it was you and not another man more sophisticated. Had you really paid court to Olga's heart, I am afraid that there would have been no hope for either of you. She asked me to tell you that Nicholas had left France. She paid him 20,000 francs to go away and stay. She is congratulating herself that she got rid of him before he tried to carry out a threat he recently made her that he should kill you at the first opportunity. She said that she should hate to think that her brother's blood was on your hands, for she is very fond of you and made no bones in saying so before the Count. It never for a moment seemed to occur to her that there might be any possibility of any other outcome of a meeting between you and Nicholas. The Count quite agreed with her in that. He added that it would take a regiment of Rokoffs to kill you. He has a most healthy respect for your prowess. Have been ordered back to my ship. She sails from Havre in 2 days under sealed orders. If you will address me in her care, the letters will find me eventually. I shall write you as soon as another opportunity presents. Your sincere friend, Paul d'Arnaud. I fear, mused Tarzan, half aloud, that Olga has thrown away her 20,000 francs. He read over that part of d'Arnaud's letter several times in which he had quoted from his conversation with Jane Porter. Tarzan derived a rather pathetic happiness from it, but it was better than no happiness at all. The following 3 weeks were quite uneventful. On several occasions, Tarzan saw the mysterious Arab, and once again he had been exchanging words with Lieutenant Gernois. But no amount of espionage or shadowing by Tarzan revealed the Arab's lodgings, the location of which Tarzan was anxious to ascertain. Gernois, never cordial, had kept more than ever aloof from Tarzan since the episode in the dining room of the hotel at Ouled-Nail. His attitude on the few occasions that they had been thrown together had been distinctly hostile. That he might keep up the appearance of the character he was playing, Tarzan spent considerable time hunting in the vicinity of Bou Saada. He would spend entire days in the foothills, ostensibly searching for gazelle, but on the few occasions that he came close enough to any of the beautiful little animals to harm them, he invariably allowed them to escape without so much as taking his rifle from its boot. The ape-man could see no sport in slaughtering the most harmless and defenseless of God's creatures for the mere pleasure of killing. In fact, Tarzan had never killed for pleasure, nor to him was there pleasure in killing. It was the joy of righteous battle that he loved, the ecstasy of victory, and the keen and successful hunt for food in which he pitted his skill and craftiness against the skill and craftiness of another. But to come out of a town filled with food to shoot down a soft-eyed, pretty gazelle, that was crueler than the deliberate and cold-blooded murder of a fellow man. Tarzan would have none of it, and so he hunted alone that none might discover the sham that he was practicing. And once, probably because of the fact that he rode alone, he was like to have lost his life. He was riding slowly through a little ravine when a shot sounded close behind him, and a bullet passed through the cork helmet he wore. Although he turned at once and galloped rapidly to the top of the ravine, there was no sign of any enemy, nor did he see aught of another human being until he reached Bou Saada. Yes, he soliloquized in recalling the occurrence, Olga has indeed thrown away her 20,000 francs. That night he was Captain Gerard's guest at a little dinner. "Your hunting has not been very fortunate?" questioned the officer. "No," replied Tarzan. "The game hereabout is timid. Nor do I care particularly about hunting game birds or antelope. I think I shall move on farther south and have a try at some of your Algerian lions." "Good," exclaimed the captain. "We are marching toward Djelfa on the morrow. You shall have company that far at least. Lieutenant Gernois and I, with 100 men, are ordered south to patrol a district in which the marauders are giving considerable trouble. Possibly we may have the pleasure of hunting the lion together. What say you?" Tarzan was more than pleased, nor did he hesitate to say so, but the captain would have been astonished had he known the real reason of Tarzan's pleasure. Gernois was sitting opposite the ape-man. He did not seem so pleased with his captain's invitation. "You will find lion hunting more exciting than gazelle shooting," remarked Captain Gerard, "and more dangerous." "Even gazelle shooting has its dangers," replied Tarzan, "especially when one goes alone. I found it so today. I also found that while the gazelle is the most timid of animals, it is not the most cowardly." He let his glance rest only casually upon Gernois after he had spoken, for he did not wish the man to know that he was under suspicion or surveillance, no matter what he might think. The effect of his remark upon him, however, might tend to prove his connection with, or knowledge of, certain recent happenings. Tarzan saw a dull red creep up from beneath Gernois' collar. He was satisfied and quickly changed the subject. When the column rode south from Bou Saada the next morning, there were 6 Arabs bringing up the rear. "They are not attached to the command," replied Gerard in response to Tarzan's query. "They merely accompany us on the road for companionship." Tarzan had learned enough about Arab character since he had been in Algeria to know that this was no real motive. For the Arab is never over fond of the companionship of strangers, and especially of French soldiers. So his suspicions were aroused, and he decided to keep a sharp eye on the little party that trailed behind the column at a distance of about 1/4 of a mile. But they did not come close enough, even during the halts, to enable him to obtain a close scrutiny of them. He had long been convinced that there were hired assassins on his trail, nor was he in great doubt but that Rokoff was at the bottom of the plot. Whether it was to be revenge for the several occasions in the past that Tarzan had defeated the Russian's purposes and humiliated him, or was in some way connected with his mission in the Gernois affair, he could not determine. If the latter, and it seemed probable since the evidence he had had that Gernois suspected him, then he had 2 rather powerful enemies to contend with, for there would be many opportunities in the wilds of Algeria, for which they were bound, to dispatch a suspected enemy quietly and without attracting suspicion. After camping at Djelfa for 2 days, the column moved to the southwest, from whence word had come that the marauders were operating against the tribes whose dowers were situated at the foot of the mountains. The little band of Arabs who had accompanied them from Bou Saada had disappeared suddenly the very night that orders had been given to prepare for the morrow's march from Djelfa. Tarzan made casual inquiries among the men, but none could tell him why they had left, or in what direction they had gone. He did not like the looks of it, especially in view of the fact that he had seen Gernois in conversation with one of them some half-hour after Captain Gerard had issued his instructions relative to the new move. Only Gernois and Tarzan knew the direction of the proposed march. All the soldiers knew was that they were to be prepared to break camp early the next morning. Tarzan wondered if Gernois could have revealed their destination to the Arabs. Late that afternoon, they went into camp at a little oasis in which was the douar of a sheik whose flocks were being stolen and whose herdsmen were being killed. The Arabs came out of their goatskin tents and surrounded the soldiers, asking many questions in the native tongue, for the soldiers were themselves natives. Tarzan, who, by this time, with the assistance of Abdul, had picked up quite a smattering of Arab, questioned one of the younger men who had accompanied the sheikh, while the latter paid his respects to Captain Gerard. No, he had seen no party of 6 horsemen riding from the direction of Jelfa. There were other oases scattered about. Possibly they had been journeying to one of these. Then there were the marauders in the mountains above. They often rode north to Bou Saada in small parties, and even as far as Ouled-Nail and Bouira. It might indeed have been a few marauders returning to the band from a pleasure trip to one of these cities. Early the next morning, Captain Gerard split his command in 2, giving Lieutenant Gernois command of one party, while he headed the other. They were to scour the mountains upon opposite sides of the plain. "And with which detachment will Monsieur Tarzan ride?" asked the captain. "Or maybe it is that Monsieur does not care to hunt marauders." "Oh, I shall be delighted to go," Tarzan hastened to explain. He was wondering what excuse he could make to accompany Gernois. His embarrassment was short-lived and was relieved from a most unexpected source. It was Gernois himself who spoke. "If my captain will forego the pleasure of Monsieur Tarzan's company for this once, I shall esteem it an honor indeed to have Monsieur ride with me today," he said, nor was his tone lacking in cordiality. In fact, Tarzan imagined that he had overdone it a trifle, but even so he was both astounded and pleased, hastening to express his delight at the arrangement. And so it was that Lieutenant Gernois and Tarzan rode off side by side at the head of the little detachment of Spahis. Gernois' cordiality was short-lived. No sooner had they ridden out of sight of Captain Gerard and his men than he lapsed once more into his accustomed taciturnity. As they advanced, the ground became rougher. Steadily it ascended toward the mountains, into which they filed through a narrow canyon close to noon. By the side of a little rivulet, Gernois called the midday halt. Here the men prepared and ate their frugal meal and refilled their canteens. After an hour's rest, they advanced again along the canyon, until they presently came to a little valley, from which several rocky gorges diverged. Here they halted, while Gernois minutely examined the surrounding heights from the center of the depression. "We shall separate here," he said, several riding into each of these gorges. And then he commenced to detail his various squads and issue instructions to the non-commissioned officers who were to command them. When he had done, he turned to Tarzan. "Monsieur will be so good as to remain here until we return." Tarzan demurred, but the officer cut him short. "There may be fighting for one of these sections," he said, "and troops cannot be embarrassed by civilian non-combatants during action." "But, my dear lieutenant," expostulated Tarzan, "I am most ready and willing to place myself under command of yourself or any of your sergeants or corporals, and to fight in the ranks as they direct. It is what I came for." "I should be glad to think so," retorted Gernois, with a sneer he made no attempt to disguise. Then shortly, "You are under my orders, and they are that you remain here until we return. Let that end the matter." And he turned and spurred away at the head of his men. A moment later, Tarzan found himself alone in the midst of a desolate mountain fastness. The sun was hot, so he sought the shelter of a nearby tree, where he tethered his horse and sat down upon the ground to smoke. Inwardly, he swore at Gernois for the trick he had played upon him. A mean little revenge, thought Tarzan, and then suddenly it occurred to him that the man would not be such a fool as to antagonize him through a trivial annoyance of so petty a description. There must be something deeper than this behind it. With the thought he arose and removed his rifle from its boot. He looked to its loads and saw that the magazine was full. Then he inspected his revolver. After this preliminary precaution, he scanned the surrounding heights and the mouths of the several gorges. He was determined that he should not be caught napping. The sun sank lower and lower, yet there was no sign of returning Spahis. At last the valley was submerged in shadow. Tarzan was too proud to go back to camp until he had given the detachment ample time to return to the valley, which he thought was to have been their rendezvous. With the closing in of night, he felt safer from attack, for he was at home in the dark. He knew that none might approach him so cautiously as to elude those alert and sensitive ears of his. Then there were his eyes, too, for he could see well at night, and his nose, if they came toward him from upwind, would apprise him of the approach of an enemy while they were still a great way off. So he felt that he was in little danger, and thus lulled to a sense of security, he fell asleep, with his back against the tree. He must have slept for several hours, for when he was suddenly awakened by the frightened snorting and plunging of his horse, the moon was shining full upon the little valley, and there, not 10 paces before him, stood the grim cause of the terror of his mount. Superb, majestic, his graceful tail extended and quivering, and his 2 eyes of fire riveted full upon his prey, stood Numa el-Adrea, the black lion. A little thrill of joy tingled through Tarzan's nerves. It was like meeting an old friend after years of separation. For a moment he sat rigid to enjoy the magnificent spectacle of this lord of the wilderness. But now Numa was crouching for the spring. Very slowly Tarzan raised his gun to his shoulder. He had never killed a large animal with a gun in all his life. Heretofore he had depended upon his spear, his poisoned arrows, his rope, his knife, or his bare hands. Instinctively he wished that he had his arrows and his knife. He would have felt surer with them. Numa was lying quite flat upon the ground now, presenting only his head. Tarzan would have preferred to fire a little from one side, for he knew what terrific damage the lion could do if he lived 2 minutes or even a minute after he was hit. The horse stood trembling in terror at Tarzan's back. The ape-man took a cautious step to one side, Numa but followed him with his eyes. Another step he took, and then another. Numa had not moved. Now he could aim at a point between the eye and the ear. His finger tightened upon the trigger, and as he fired, Numa sprang. At the same instant the terrified horse made a last frantic effort to escape. The tether parted, and he went careening down the canyon toward the desert. No ordinary man could have escaped those frightful claws when Numa sprang from so short a distance, but Tarzan was no ordinary man. From earliest childhood, his muscles had been trained by the fierce exigencies of his existence to act with the rapidity of thought. As quick as was el-Adrea, Tarzan of the Apes was quicker, and so the great beast crashed against a tree where he had expected to feel the soft flesh of man, while Tarzan, a couple of paces to the right, pumped another bullet into him that brought him clawing and roaring to his side. Twice more Tarzan fired in quick succession, and then el-Adrea lay still and roared no more. It was no longer Monsieur Jean Tarzan. It was Tarzan of the Apes that put a savage foot upon the body of his savage kill, and raising his face to the full moon, lifted his mighty voice in the weird and terrible challenge of his kind. A bull ape had made his kill, and the wild things in the wild mountains stopped in their hunting and trembled at this new and awful voice, while down in the desert the children of the wilderness came out of their goatskin, tense, and looked toward the mountains, wondering what new and savage scourge had come to devastate their flocks. A half-mile from the valley in which Tarzan stood, a score of white-robed figures, bearing long, wicked-looking guns, halted at the sound and looked at one another with questioning eyes. But presently, as it was not repeated, they took up their silent, stealthy way toward the valley. Tarzan was now confident that Gernois had no intention of returning for him, but he could not fathom the object that had prompted the officer to desert him, yet leave him free to return to camp. His horse gone, he decided that it would be foolish to remain longer in the mountains, so he set out toward the desert. He had scarcely entered the confines of the canyon when the first of the white-robed figures emerged into the valley upon the opposite side. For a moment, they scanned the little depression from behind sheltering boulders, but when they had satisfied themselves that it was empty, they advanced across it. Beneath the tree at one side, they came upon the body of el-Adrea. With muttered exclamations, they crowded about it. Then, a moment later, they hurried down the canyon, which Tarzan was threading a brief distance in advance of them. They moved cautiously and in silence, taking advantage of shelter, as men do who are stalking man.